Hello, I'm Ann Helmreich, Director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities here at Case Western Reserve University. And I'm visiting with Dr. Robert Bruegmann, who's our short-term visiting fellow in our faculty seminar on the theme of cityscapes. And Dr. Bruegmann is visiting here from Chicago, from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he'll be speaking tonight on the subject of Cleveland and global sprawl, and this comes from his work, his book, Sprawl, A Compact History. So if you don't mind if I just jump right in with my first question.
Please do.
I was looking over your CV and I was noticing that your first published article, and I want to make sure I get this right, the topic was Early Central Heating and Forced Ventilation in Architectural Design. And I should mention that that won the Society of Architectural Historians Award for Best Article by a Young Scholar. But anyway, now you're writing on sprawl. And at first I couldn't connect the dots, central heating, ventilation, sprawl. But then I began to think about the ways in which in the book you refer to the city as a kind of system. And I was thinking about buildings as systems. Am I on the right track? Do you think buildings and cities can be compared as systems? Or am I making a false analogy?
No, you're completely on the right track. I was actually, in my dissertation, I was actually working on hospitals, prisons, insane asylums in late 18th century and early 19th century Paris, London, Europe generally. And I guess that I was doing that because I've always been interested in cities. And if you're interested in cities, then those big institutions were really the largest building blocks at the edge of those large 19th century cities. So to understand those in turn, you had to understand that for a hospital, for example, the most important thing was trying to keep good air circulation. They believed in the 19th century that it was dark areas and dirty areas that caused disease, and so the remedy for that was as much air as possible. And that's what drove those programs. So yes, exactly. Trying to understand the city meant understanding the pieces of it, and the pieces of it then in turn you had to understand the systems that drove them.
And I was thinking, in the wake of Foucault, there's been a lot of relooking at hospitals and insane asylums and prisons as places of panopticon power and control. But in your book on sprawl, you don't ever point to one source of power and says, this is where all the decisions are made. It's in fact, you show us that the city, thinking about it as a system, is a contribution of so many different choices made by individuals over a course of time. I mean, has your thinking about power and structures of power and how change is affected, has that changed over time from looking at institutions like a prison or a hospital, one built structure, to looking at a whole broad city?
No, actually, I don't think so. And I think that I was always very uncomfortable with people who did these very big systems approaches to understanding things. I think that there was that people like Foucault gave a major contribution with ideas about structuralism, but they tended to take things too far. They tended to suggest that people, individual, ordinary human beings, didn't have much say in what happened in the built environment. And that's something I fundamentally don't believe. I believe that where I choose to live, where I choose to get groceries, if you multiply that times 1 million choices like mine, that is ultimately the biggest factor in cities. So I'm a great believer in the fact that individuals have choices, they exercise those choices, and ultimately that's what the city is all about, is the sum total of all of those choices, even for people who unfortunately have very few choices. So for me, it was easy enough going from hospitals to sprawl. In the case of hospitals, obviously there was an architect, there was a group that commissioned them, whereas the city is much wider, but I think it's the same mechanism, and I think in all cases the way to understand it is to try to get at every individual, every group, see what their stakes are and why they act the way they do. So yeah, I would say that my approach has been fairly consistent on that.
About the notion of choice.
About choice, yes.
And then I was thinking too, and we talked a little bit about this before, that you grew up near Pittsburgh, you went to graduate school in Philadelphia, you've lived in Chicago for over 30 years, and I was wondering, going back to the notion of individual and individual experience, has your life experience being in those cities had an impact on your work and the questions you ask? Because I think those cities have had a very particular history over the last 30 years, a pretty rough economic history for Chicago's really come back, but Pittsburgh and Philadelphia had some really hard moments. Will the garbage be picked up tomorrow kind of moments. So has your kind of life experience in these particular urban settings shaped how you turn around and ask the questions about the notion of the city and the built environment?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I've never thought about it in that way. I'm sure it has. It's not as though I chose those places. Those are the places where the school that accepted me was, or the university that would be willing to hire me were. I would have been, I'm sure, just as happy to go to Phoenix or to Los Angeles, which interests me a great deal. But in fact, yes, these are cities that at the time that I was going to graduate school in the 1970s and then just coming out of graduate school, these were cities in crisis. They were in very deep crisis. But of course, that's affected almost everybody in the country, and particularly academics who tend to live in central cities. So I think that this experience probably just made more apparent to me both the fragility of institutions and cities, but also, in a strange kind of way, their toughness and their longevity. Because I think that one of the things that happened during those years were that governments, people tried to scramble to try to get all kinds of new schemes to remake the cities. And I think that that kind of top-down approach hardly ever works. In fact, cities come back when sometimes, unfortunately, they've sunk so low that they're a great relative bargain, and then they come back. But I think in general, they come back self-generated from the bottom up and hardly ever really from the top down.
So is that sort of, are you thinking of neighborhood revitalization efforts when you say come back from the bottom up?
Absolutely. In other words, I don't think that all those billions and billions of dollars that the federal government spent on rehabilitation and revitalization programs, I don't think those were, maybe they were actually a hindrance in some cases, but I don't think they really did as much good as people thought they would, or some people think maybe they did. I think that instead, there has to be a change that comes from within. It comes from communities believing that they can do things, in some cases from newcomers arriving and not being bound by all of the restrictions and the kind of strangulation that seemed to have gripped the previous generation.
In fact, I was struck in your book about your example that where where the British planning model could most emphatically be imposed, in fact, became in some ways the least successful. So where the planners had the most control about enforcing regulations, it strangled growth rather than their hope to, I guess, control it and have it grow in predictable ways.
Yeah, and it's that predictable ways that I think is the key there. And I think what you realize is whenever you study a city, you realize that this is the most complicated organism we have. It's as complicated as any sort of atomic structure or biological mechanism. It's so complicated that no single individual or even small group can understand. And because of that, the future is unknowable. Even 10 years from now, we don't really know what our source of energy is going to be. So if you think about planning as a small group of people who are experts, and they're going to decide what the future will be and then how to get there, to me, that's almost doomed to fail, or at least it probably won't work as well as having 10 million people in a metropolitan area, all of them planning all the time. They together have much more knowledge than that small group of planners.
Of course, there must be, what do you do when these small groups kind of bump up against each other? Because I can imagine there would be some zones in a city where there's kind of competing interests that, you know, I'm a resident in this area, I want to see it come back as a residential zone, and then the commercial interests say, no, I want to rezone these because these would be ideal as a retail district.
So, and of course, that's the great dilemma of a democratic government. Now, a lot of people say, and particularly you hear this in academia, that it's the government that should adjudicate these things because government people are the ones that have no stake in one side or the other, so they can create something that's best for everybody. But you know, actually, government employees, bureaucrats, politicians, they have the same stakes, the same incentives as anyone else does. Not only that, but any given individual, as an individual, is both part of the private market and part of the government voting process, and they act in one sphere the same way they act in another. That is, I think probably most people try to maximize personal advantage, but I don't think that the vast majority of people do that at the expense of other people if they can help it. So to me, the idea that there's somehow some right way or wrong way to do this and that the there should be a government structure in place that decides the relative merits of things. I would take a much more democratic and open approach to that.
But I know from reading some review responses you've written that you're not either, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you're not advocating a total free market, free-for-all kind of approach either. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit, just so it's not, you're not swinging one way, or you're not, the pendulum isn't going all the way to the opposite side either.
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest things for readers of my book, because they assume that if I don't think that large-scale planning is the answer, that means that necessarily I don't think there should be any public planning at all. No, quite the contrary. I think that government planning has a good role, and in some cases it's had a spectacular role. The lakefront park system in Chicago, for example, or a lot of our infrastructure that was publicly planned actually did a very good job on it. We used to have institutions like the post office, which used to run spectacularly well, that were public. So I definitely don't think the government should stay out of it. I think, though, that the most important thing for government is that it needs to do things where there's a fair degree of agreement on what ought to be done, and a fair amount of agreement on how to do it. If one of those two is lacking, government finds that it can often get in way over its head. And I think in the 60s we made a lot of experiments with the war on poverty, or all kinds of things where we went in optimistically thinking we could solve age-old problems, and we found that that's just beyond the realm of government. And when that happens, you very often lose credibility in government rather than gaining it. And I think we're still grappling with that legacy of overreaching.
Right. So you have a disaffected population now.
Yes.
Whereas if I hear what you're saying, it's sort of, using today's phrase, a kind of buy-in process.
Right, exactly. If the government had been much more careful about fixing the potholes, picking up the garbage, and perhaps a little less interested in, let's say, busing students all across the country to achieve a 50-50 racial balance, I think we probably would be probably have more faith in government today to do the things that government can and should do.
I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about your Lawndale project, because I think that's an example where you're working within a community, but then that community works with a larger entity, right? The City Design Center, am I correct in that?
City Design Center is a program at University of Illinois at Chicago between the College of Architecture and the Arts and the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. And that was the entity that really got involved in Lawndale. Lawndale is a poor, largely African-American community on the far west side of Chicago. And what I was interested in, and the reason I was willing to participate, is because it had what I thought was a rather interesting and new approach to urban revitalization. And that was the idea of using heritage. And by heritage, I mean the history, the story, the existing built environment. The idea of using heritage as both community organizing and economic development tool. In other words, if a community could get themselves involved in something where they could show some progress, saving a building, putting this group of buildings on the National Register, that's really empowering to people. On the other hand, the idea was that if we could make those buildings, if we could change the opinion about these really wonderful buildings, a lot of gray stone 2 flats and 3 flats, the most spectacular synagogues, now AME churches, that this reevaluation would do more if we could just, by this process, raise those property values, let's say 2% more than they would otherwise. This would be more money, more equity coming into the neighborhood than all the government programs, all the not-for-profit grants that we could have gotten, and would be something that was coming from the bottom up. It was coming from the faith, the belief of people in this neighborhood that their history was important. It was just as important as that of people that lived on the Gold Coast.
So in addition to that piece of the people within the neighborhood sort of re-seeing their neighborhood, you're also inviting people from outside to reevaluate it. In many ways, it sounds like almost aesthetically, right? That you can see these buildings in a new way, not as, oh, the street I don't want to drive by or drive down, but as something, as value and as you said, sort of aesthetic terms, which is really
Yes.
hard to quantify.
Yes.
But if you can attach value to that, then the value gets attached to the property.
Yeah.
Is the argument?
No, that's absolutely right. We tend to relegate aesthetics to a second role, that it's less important than, let's say, getting the foundations to be stable or fixing the window. Well, to some extent that's true. If you don't fix the window, the water's going to come in and it's going to ruin the interior. But aesthetics and aesthetic urge seems primordial. It seems that it's been something that's been with humans for as long as human beings have lived, and it's intimately bound up with a sense of well-being, of safety, of protection, of just satisfaction and enjoyment. And livability. And so, yes, absolutely, if you can get people to focus on these great synagogues, if we could, for example, get enough money to restore the facades, to light them at night. Now this, people would say, this is sheer boondoggle, wasted money, wasted time. I don't think so. I think that that is actually the way to get people to think about the more important things, like where's the money going to come from to actually fix the interior of these places and fix the roof. That until you actually spotlight that, literally spotlight it, it's sometimes hard for people to get interested in it.
It's almost asking for an emotional value or investment
Absolutely.
put in before the fiscal investment goes in. And these kind of aesthetic strategies are about creating that emotional value. I was thinking, I was reading a review of the exhibition about Jane Jacobs that's up at the Municipal Art Society in New York, and I want to make sure I get this quote right. She said, there is a basic aesthetic limitation on what can be done with cities. And I was thinking, rephrasing that quote, do we have sometimes an aesthetic limitation on our imagination about how to look at cities, that we keep kind of going down these same paths, but we can't seem to break out as this aesthetic kind of confined? I mean, what could we do to open up our aesthetic imagination so that we don't make claims that there's a limitation on what could be done with cities? How can we learn how to look at them differently than we have been?
That's exactly, yeah, I think that's exactly what we're trying to do in Lawndale. I think Jane Jacobs, when she was talking about that, she was thinking about the kind of assault on cities by planners and architects who thought they were going to wipe away all of this disorderly development and put in place great new architectural masterpieces. But I think that from just the other side, the idea that this apparently disorderly, motley collection of buildings is actually, for me, the record, in built form, the record of all those people who built the buildings, who lived there, who did the garden in front, who may have repaired the window or not repaired the window, and thinking of it that way as the most important embodiment of what generations of people have done in a single place over time, that kind of visual aesthetic response is very often the key to trying to think of the city as a whole as something for which we are only stewards. It's not ours to do with what we want. It's something that we inherited from someone else and that we need to pass on to our children, our grandchildren.
Which is interesting because it seems like it's suggesting looking at some of those places in the city not as problems, but again, it's going back to the notion of choice. So why did someone choose to do this way, and try to understand the structures or the way a neighborhood develops in terms of the result of choices, which I think, because we were such a transient population, might be hard to recover. You know, I think there's maybe one person on my street who's original homeowner when these houses were built. So I wonder which way the fact that we're so transient pushes against creating emotional value and aesthetic value for some of these for neighborhoods that get kind of left behind as people move along.
Well, I think that for everybody, that continuity is important, and even in the neighborhood where almost everybody changes, it's still important for them to feel some connection with the past. When you have a rupture, which is what happened in Lawndale, where the community was almost entirely Jewish, and then within the space of 10 years, it became almost entirely African American. The institutions simply collapsed, or they went elsewhere, new ones had to be established, and you lost that. And you can see that that's a hugely traumatic event in the life of the city. People can come and go with great regularity, particularly in affluent suburbs, and the institutions and the institutional memory remains. So the idea that in a place like Lawndale, where if you're a 12-year-old kid from Lawndale and you go to the library to read about African-American Lawndale, you won't find anything. Lots of books about Jewish Lawndale, but nothing about African-American Lawndale. And if that happens, then you can well understand how you would discount the value of a neighborhood like that. So the idea of heritage here, of allowing people to believe that their story is as important as anyone else's story, gives, I think, a sense that the neighborhood is something of value in itself and should be honored and preserved.
And I think there's probably great lessons in that for cities like Cleveland that are going through these changes. I mean, it makes me think about a project near the mattress factory in Pittsburgh where they've taken a facade of a house and set into it gravestones, which sounds rather grim, but they mark the names of the people who once lived in the house and their profession and how long they lived there. And it makes you look at that row house in a completely different way to realize 4 different families once occupied, you know, basically a 6-room house, and all the occupations, seamstresses and things like that. So I wonder if are there places you've seen in cities, good examples of how, in addition to Lawndale, where people have created this kind of value and this reattachment back to the city?
Well, a classic example is the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side of New York, where by taking a building and then recreating all those histories of people that went through, they're not only telling the story of that building, but that building in miniature tells the story of those millions and millions of people that flowed through the Lower East Side of New York. And in a way, that's the story of America. So I think that all of these small-scale attempts are attempts to recapture that story and to try to make sense of it for individuals living today through a similar experience, but in very different physical circumstances.
And I know you've been working on this issue of sprawl and density for a long time. Are there cities that, since you began your research, you've gone back several times and you've been kind of surprised or pleased or, you know, I don't know, or irate about what you've seen happen? Are there places that you feel like are great models or things we should take lessons from?
Actually, mostly I've been very pleasantly surprised, because when I started this work, which was in the 80s, it was in the wake of the really disastrous economic climate of the 1970s. And that economic climate was the culmination of decades of post-war industrial dislocation. All American industries went through violent upheavals during those years. A lot of it has reconfigured, a lot of it has left these shores. But since that time, since the 1980s, it's been rather remarkable to me the way even the cities that seem to be most down and out, and by that I mean St. Louis, Detroit, Newark, and many smaller cities, Benton Harbor, Michigan, for example, these cities almost all show a great deal of signs of new life. Now, it's a little hard to see to the casual visitor, but if you start to look at property values, if you look at property values in central Cleveland, and if you go driving around central Cleveland, you see that the corner was probably turned somewhere in the 1980s, and that we're not seeing that same abandonment. We're seeing now, if anything, a filling in, vast new possibilities through very large areas of central Cleveland. Part of it is just that a lot of what was there is now gone. And what that creates is space. It creates space to do new things and property values that are low enough so that people who have gone out to the very edge of the metropolitan area can now conceive of coming back and building something that may even be no more expensive than it would out in Medina. And given the choice to live in Medina or to live in central Cleveland, there's a lot going for central Cleveland. Yeah, proximity to cultural institutions, things like that. Of course, it makes it difficult for the heritage once you get some of these, streets that have been, wiped clean and new buildings go in. So I'm sure there must be tension too between these places that are trying to claim a heritage and then places that are these sites of new building and new kinds of design. And I guess that's just something that the neighborhoods have to work out for themselves. True, but I think that it's a mistake to think that respect for heritage means that you have to have buildings that look like they're in a period style, or even to have old buildings. Certainly, cities are all about constant change, and much of that constant change is shockingly modern at the time it's done, but it then becomes part of the heritage as well. I mean, when I'm talking about heritage, I think I'm talking about something much deeper, and that's a kind of basic respect for place, for community, for other people, for continuity in the city. Not so much about the actual style. Now, it would be nice if it included a sense that you want to keep the best, but and build the best new. But I mean, I think that I'm talking about something that's much broader than just the way it looks at a given moment.
Well, hearing you define heritage makes me think I probably should have asked you to define your sense of sprawl, your working definition, because that is such a slippery concept.
Right.
And I know in a way you're like, well, that's why I wrote the book,
Yeah.
and go through my footnotes, and I have. But you know, there's ways in which sometimes you say, you know, words like you know, cluster mixing and things like that, they don't really describe what I'm talking about here. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking a moment briefly to define sprawl, even though you've taken a whole book to do it as well.
No, I didn't actually.
Well, okay.
And I don't want to define sprawl. And the reason is that I think it's a disastrous term. I think it's a very poor analytical tool. I think it confuses, it lumps together all kinds of issues, some of them real and important, some of them trivial, some of them connected with this process of decentralization, and some not at all. So I guess the lesson from the book is not that I want to try to define it any better. I want to show that it's never had a consistent definition. And one of the reasons is because for people who are campaigning against it, they don't want to put too fine a point on it. If they did, many of their supporters would find they themselves live in sprawl. So sprawl has always been where other people live, the product of other people's bad choices. And so I'm trying to simply point out that sprawl as a concept is probably a very unhappy one, and that we'd be better off forgetting about sprawl. Let's talk about the individual problems, and then I think we'd be much better off.
Right, right. And that we could, going back to the notion of choice, if you identify individual problems, there's a place where you can put agency and action.
Yes.
Whereas otherwise it just seems so amorphous. What do I do if I'm concerned that my local school is closing? How do I understand that and its effect on my neighborhood? Might that be a good thing? Maybe I shouldn't be quite so anxious.
And I think an openness to possibilities is really important. That at first glance, it seems ridiculous, for example, to close a central city school and open one up in the far suburbs. But a little bit of reflection would tell you that in many cases, that infrastructure we have at the center, which people say, oh, we have to reuse, in many cases, it's not up to current standards. Better to sell it off, probably, make it into condominiums because the number of school children has declined, build a new structure with all of the latest technology that you need for a school building, rather than try to force that back into the old building. It's not necessarily better one way or another, but I think that you need to leave your mind open to all the possibilities.
Yeah. Now, I know you spent the morning going through Western Reserve Historical Society archives, and I know on Saturday we're going to take a group on the bus to go around Cleveland. But are there neighborhoods in Cleveland that you find particularly intriguing, that you're eager to find out more about, or you got some pleasant surprises in the archives? Just sort of curious what your reflections on Cleveland at this moment. I don't want to preempt your lecture too much.
No, Cleveland always amazes me. Cleveland is a little bit like, let's say, St. Louis or Detroit. These are places where the first thing that comes to mind usually isn't the splendor of the built fabric, but this city has immense, just absolutely astonishing richness of that built fabric, also complexity of it. So I think what I saw this morning that was most surprising or most interesting in some ways was that tangle down in the flats of all these levels and roads that switch back and forth, and the absolute chaos of industry down there. It's just I can't think of another place in America that was so apparently chaotic. Now, of course, it isn't chaotic. It was all very carefully controlled and you know, in a kind of a sense, logical. But you take a look at it, I mean, and still today, it's the same way. You're driving on a road and you see these 4 levels above you of bridges crossing over in all directions, and you think, how in the world could this ever have happened? And then you go back and you look at those aerial photographs and you see, oh, I see, the canal was there and the B&O Railroad went over that canal. This was a lumber yard, and that's why there's that terracing. So yeah, that's clearly one of them. But there's a lot of others. Every time I come here, I go by different routes, and I always love driving through places like Lyndhurst, let's say, or the 1950s suburbs. There's a very, very thick ring around Cleveland of 50 suburbs, and that's the kind of landscape that a lot of people just write off because they say there's nothing there, it's uninteresting, it's this lower middle class landscape, and these are buildings not worth looking at. But even within the very relatively small choices that people had, do you put a tree here, do you put a tree on that side, do you have a big picture window on this side, or do you have a couple windows across? It's really fascinating, that cityscape, and just reading it and what's happened in all those years since they were built in the 50s.
Well, and it's wonderful to have a kind of academic interest brought to what my neighbors and I all love to do, which is to walk around our neighborhood exactly and see the set template of about 5 different houses that were used in our area, and then exactly all the individual choices people do, and then, oh, that's where that is in their house. So,
yes, exactly.
And in fact, yeah, you're translating into an academic question or set of questions and exploration, what we've been doing with our, our Sunday afternoons.
And the great challenge to this is that you can do it very easily with a city that you're familiar with, but in fact, since the same material conditions existed across most of the United States, what you see in Cleveland in the 1950s is not different in kind from what you would see outside Boston or Phoenix or Seattle. And then it's really interesting because, and this I think is an indictment of architectural history, we have no good studies of average ordinary building stock. There were bungalows in every American city in the 1920s, but they looked very different in Chicago. These brick bungalows with the bay front and the hipped roofs, they look very different in Chicago than they would in St. Louis or Los Angeles or Cleveland for that matter. And it's amazing to me, we have so little literature, so little scholarship on the places where most Americans live.
Yeah, and that makes up whatever percentage of our cities. This fabric. We tend to focus on the great buildings, the decisive moments, to the neglect of the everyday.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's a great contribution of your scholarship. And maybe going back to my original question, heating, ventilation, those are all everyday concerns as well that we tend to not look at, and they're buried inside the building. So maybe what you've been making us do all these years is, stop and pay attention to the everyday.
I'd like to think so.
Yeah. So, well, thank you very much, and we look forward to your lecture later on this evening.
My pleasure.
Thank you.